why is it imperative for us to really chart social change, and what do we hope to learn from that?
Yeah, I don't know if I want to go so far as to say it's imperative. I run a magazine, and so we explore things that are curious to us. And the sort of genesis for, we actually did something unusual. We spent 2 whole issues, which is basically 6 months of the year, in various forms in the magazine, through podcasts, through events, just trying to understand this whole phenomenon of how social change happens. We know change happens, like we're about to enter this perhaps whole new era of AI coming down the pike. And I think the more I'm learning about it, I'm finally taking seriously, like, this could actually be quite a momentous shift. It may not be, but I think it's more likely this than even social media was, or than even parts of the Industrial Revolution. So we know, things change from advances in technology, natural disaster, swells in immigration. Like, you can look at societal shifts based upon those kinds of moves that are more incurred either by crisis or war or invention. But I was interested in specifically like movements, and movements that shift the norms in a society over centuries. And I don't know if it's imperative specifically for people of faith to think about that or explore it, but I do think there is something about when you pray the Lord's Prayer and you say, you ask, like, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that is a line that is asking for some level of co-creation with God in the redeeming of his world. So I'm interested in these like inflection points that we can look back on and say, what was going on when suddenly everyone decided that, or not suddenly, but over time, everyone decided that slavery was an abominable evil. Like, when before that, churchgoers and Bible scholars were often using those texts to support it, just as an example. Or what was going on when people decided, I'm always interested in the rehumanization missions, like what was going on when like women were suddenly given greater equality. And it was actually, a side note, interesting, just being in the Czech Republic, I went to the Museum of Communism, and they begin at the end of World War II as they take you through the sequence of Stalin and Mao. And in the early years, like, here we know, like, oh, communism in its actual reality has been so bad. But as you begin and you sort of see these post-Hitler, post-fascist era, you see the propaganda posters. And I was like, oh, everyone looks so happy in these posters. I probably would have been drawn into this. The women are so equal to men, like women were brought in. Like, it was interesting just to be like, well, there's different forces that are often modeled morally in terms of what they yield over the long term of history. And I think God can use all of our misguided visions of reality and visions of the future. So I think the reason to care about social change is as a Christian, to be to sort of take seriously our stewardship of the world and our stewardship of history, and believe that somehow, like, God works through grand sweeps as much as the small. And we were interested in exploring both the huge and the small, the public and the private, the hidden and the public activism, moral change versus legal change. The second, like, large point to make is that our interest in social change in a funny sort of way is equivalent to an interest in coherence. Like, what is cohering our world and specifically in the West, like our society? And I think I have felt in my own lifetime that when I read Letter from a Birmingham Jail, and I study like all the different like local ways in the Deep South where you are that wound up like unfurling into this civil rights movement, and sort of the genesis of that earlier in the century. And I'm like so moved. And I think the Christian in me is deeply moved because I see this like many becoming one, and I see conversions of heart and mind. And I see people who had long been victimized stepping up to the plate and self-sacrificing to lead and be patient and be gracious. And there was this like movement that ultimately I would say that's like some move of the Spirit was happening through courageous people and strategic coordination. And it felt like it created a sea wave in shifting a nation. So now to be called a racist is like one of the worst things you could be called. Mm-hmm. And why does it feel like movements since then that have been hashtagged out on Twitter, that have been Occupy Wall Street, that have been Black Lives Matter, that have been Me Too, like these various things that like rise up in the public consciousness and in our media. Why does it feel like while many of them begin from a worthy place, they tend to fracture our society months later or a year or two later? They don't create this like permanent groundswell that leads to greater justice, that leads to a shalom. They tend to just like wind up, they enter into a tribalized era, and people are not converted, they're hard-hearted. And so I think out of my own frustration with the sense of, on the one hand, to your point, there is so much technological change. It feels like life is going faster than ever. Time is just, we can't keep up with it. We're all overwhelmed. We all feel isolated somehow as we're doing our best. But it's just, there's not a sense of like one national, with of course fractious and debate, we can always have that, but there's not a sense of like a coherent move together towards a new day, even a little iterative new day. All of that is largely driven by Silicon Valley. Like the united moves are driven by technology, not by like a positive vision of the good that is shared. So out of that frustration of like stuckness and disintegration was just this question of like, could we ever see? I mean, that's why I was so moved by watching, again, this is as a person of faith, but I was just really moved by watching what happened at Asbury earlier this year, and that outpouring of just like, I do think like ultimately there's something charismatic that needs to happen, and a movement of the Spirit of God that stirs us. And it's not about elites, and it's not about human pride and credit. Like there's something that is instigated by God himself in ways that are mysterious, but can we set the conditions to listen and respond? And the jury's out on, what that outpouring, if, what has happened. And I think probably a lot of things have changed at quiet, hidden levels that's not covered in any media story. But I still haven't seen like institutional coordination or health prepared to respond to that kind of awakening. But I was given so much hope by watching that largely on YouTube, because it felt like, okay, people are getting to the end of themselves. This is a community of people I'm watching humble themselves and like begin from a place of like personal confession. And that seems to be the healthiest place to begin, to whether it's confessing Christian nationalism or whatever. And it's a desire for people to take their responsibility as stewards of thy kingdom come seriously. And it's also a yearning for coherence.
Which is not easy to do. You talk about the Spirit of God at the end of the day is who is the one who must bring revival, a deep transformation in those deep structures of culture. I remember I was going back and forth in an email thread with James Davison Hunter about those very things. And it's not easy to generate that. On one level, we say, hey, this can happen. And we see these whispers of it. These little, they're being whispered about. And you do want to see it. And I, like everyone else, marveled. I couldn't believe how many people jumped on it to knock it down.
I know. Unfortunately, I sort of could believe it, but because I was initially skeptical. I mean, I have a charismatic strand to my spirituality, so I'm always open, but I wasn't sure at first. I was hearing rumors of it. And then finally I just like encountered it. A friend of mine went, took a video, and I just like watched it, experienced it directly, albeit through a screen. And I was very moved, like spiritually. I just like the Holy Spirit was like, this is real. Something really real is happening. And then you watch like the guys, the Gospel Coalition, and like the Doug Wilsons of, I don't know Doug Wilson himself, but like that type, I'm naming names just to name names, like just are like, this is emotive. And yeah, my first reaction, I was very angry and annoyed. And then I just, it's not surprising. But it is interesting who those critiques come from. And it's like, why have we so lost the expectation for God to show up in a burning bush? Something about that feels like a major, what's the word I'm looking for? Not challenge to, but critique of, I'm missing the word here. We should be ashamed of our lack of preparation.